Thank you all for joining our program on COVID lessons from South Korea, all about COVID-19 vaccines with global vaccine expert, Dr. Jerome Kim. We are honored that Dr. Kim is joining us today from Seoul as we speak about his work with vaccines and global public health. I am Tom Byrne, President and CEO of the Korea Society, located here in New York City. I would like to thank all our corporate, individual, and foundation supporters who have made programs such as today's possible as we strive to fulfill our mission of enhancing awareness, understanding, and cooperation between the peoples of Korea and America. I'd now like to introduce our today's guest, Dr. Jerome Kim. Jerome Kim, MD, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, IVI. Jerome is an international expert on the evaluation and development of vaccines. He has strong scientific experience, which spans basic research through advanced clinical development. Dr. Kim is a graduate of the University of Hawaii, a Bachelor of Arts, and Yale University, MD. Dr. Kim completed internal medicine and infectious disease training at Duke University Medical Center. Dr. Kim's research interests include HIV molecular epidemiology, host genetics, and HIV vaccine development. Dr. Kim was Principal Deputy and Chief Laboratory of Molecular Virology and Pathogenesis at U.S. Military HIV Research Program at Fort Detrick, Maryland. He has authored over 160 publications and received the John Marr Award for Research Excellence from the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in 2013. Dr. Kim is a professor of medicine at the Uniformed Services University at the Health Sciences and an adjunct professor of Graduate School of Public Health of Seoul National University. He is a fellow of the American College of Physicians and the Infectious Diseases Society of America. Dr. Kim, how did you choose medicine as your career path? And what led to your appointment as Director General of the IVI in 2015?
That's an interesting question. Actually, I found something as we were unpacking, and something I guess my mother had saved from the fourth grade. And I said in that I wanted to be a rocket scientist, and I guess I'm not a rocket scientist, but during high school, I developed an interest in biology and biological research, and medicine seemed like a natural fit. My mother was a nurse, my grandmother was a nurse, so it was kind of in the family, and I just really appreciated the aspects of research and helping people that medicine offered. And so I applied pretty much, well, actually exclusively to medical schools, and got into to several, and then picked the one farthest away from home. Growing up in Hawaii, New Haven, Connecticut, it's pretty far away, about as far away as you can get, is what my mother said. And in order to go there, I joined the military, because at that time, and actually the program still exists, there is a way for you to go to medical school and have the military pay your tuition and give you a stipend and pay for your books. And the deal is that you pay them back year for year. So for 4 years of medical school, I owed the U.S. Air Force 4 years of service. And they kind of forgot about me. They let me go to Duke to do a civilian residency and fellowship. I let them know that I'd gotten a grant and asked for an extension. They said, sure. And then I got another grant and wrote again, requesting another extension of my civilian time at Duke. And I received an email from a Colonel Neil Boswell, with whom I've now become friends. And the email said, I don't know who you are, and I don't understand why, but no, we're not letting you off the hook. This was during the first Gulf War. And, Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. The U.S. military was building up, and he said, we're going to activate you. And so on the day of the first attack against Baghdad, I was in officer basic training in Texas with the Air Force. And they put me in a hospital. It was a very short war. They put me in a hospital for a month and then sent me on to work at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, which is where the HIV research program, vaccine research program is for the military. And it was a joint program at that time. And so they needed an Air Force officer, and I was the one. Well, while I was at Duke, I was doing HIV research. And so transitioning to HIV vaccine research wasn't a problem. Now, of course, my first boss was Bob Redfield, who's just stepped down as the head of the Center for Disease Control. And after Bob left and went to the University of Maryland, Dr. Debbie Birx, who's just stepped down as the COVID coordinator, but also the global AIDS and public health coordinator for the State Department, was my boss. So the program has had some very illustrious heads. But in the end, I think it was the right decision. I really loved doing research. The military afforded me an opportunity to work on HIV vaccines. And, the experience from HIV vaccines really did inform a lot of the work that we do and the way we approach vaccines and what we call unincentivized infectious diseases at IVI.
Mm-hmm. Right. Actually, if I can just hone in on something, that's a new term I've heard, unincentivized infectious diseases. What does that mean exactly?
That's a great question. So we talk about diseases that exist in high-income countries, and I'll just pick one. Rotavirus diarrhea. Now, the vast majority of American children have been vaccinated against rotavirus. Mm-hmm. It was a vaccine that was invented or licensed in the US in 2006. Shortly after that, rotavirus diarrhea pretty much disappeared in the United States. In fact, if you were a medical student or a doctor in training, you might not even see a case in the United States.
Right. Mm.
The World Health Organization approved the vaccine in 2009, recommended in 2009, and in 2021, 60% of the world's children still do not receive their 3 doses of rotavirus vaccine. Mm-hmm. So that's an incentivized vaccine. That's a vaccine that the big vaccine companies, in this case, Merck and GlaxoSmithKline, went after, got licenses in high-income countries, and then gradually it makes its way into low-income countries. The reverse is true for certain vaccines that don't have high disease burden in high-income countries. So, for instance, IVI's first vaccine was a vaccine for cholera. Now, cholera has disappeared in most of the major countries in the West by the 20th century, with the development of sewage systems and good sanitation and hygiene. But it remains a problem in much of the world, killing maybe between 100,000 and 200,000 people a year and causing massive outbreaks. Mm-hmm. I think people may recall after the big Haitian earthquake, there was a huge outbreak of cholera in Haiti. Mm-hmm. Really the first time in a long time that it's been in over 100 years that it had been in the country. Mm-hmm. But IVI's worked on that vaccine. Technology transferred it to companies around the world that make it, worked with the WHO and the vaccine alliance called Gavi to create a stockpile. And gradually, countries became interested. Countries that never reported a case of cholera before began to develop an interest in this vaccine that would prevent a significant proportion of cholera cases occurring in their countries. So that, we went from 2 million doses a year now to a request in excess of 70 million doses a year. Wow. But not from the United States or Europe, from countries around the world that are low and middle income. So this is a vaccine that is unincentivized. The vaccine costs $1.30 a dose, mm-hmm. which is, the kind of vaccine that you need for global health. Right. So GSK or Merck, or in this case now Sanofi, have no interest in that because their profit margins are different from developing country vaccine manufacturers that are capable of manufacturing high quality vaccines that can be WHO approved, mm-hmm. But that don't have the same financial structure that the big vaccine manufacturers do.
Right. So I guess the big vaccine manufacturers, they're incentivized if they can sell their product at a price that gives them a decent profit in a market with a lot of demand. Is that another?
That's exactly the case.
Yeah.
So the vaccine against pneumonia for that that is made by Pfizer
Hmm.
brings in $7 billion a year. It's a really amazing vaccine. I mean, if you vaccinate the children, their grandparents are protected against this particular kind of pneumonia. Pfizer sells that vaccine for up to $200 a dose in the United States.
Wow.
The global health price for that same vaccine is $3.05 a dose. And an Indian company now is making a version of it that is $2 a dose. And really, $2 a dose vaccine is the kind of vaccine that we can really use in global health.
Right.
Pfizer's really not interested in that.
Right. Hmm. Right. Right. I wonder which pneumonia vaccine I got about a year ago. If it was a good one, whichever one.
Probably that one.
I'm not sure if I paid 200. Maybe my health plan did. Um, okay, so you have an interest in HIV research, HIV vaccine development. I also understand that probably more recently you're part of a small group of researchers helping to push forward the decoding of the human immune system. Can you talk a little about that?
Yes. So, vaccines are probably one of our oldest tools to understand
Mhm.
these protective responses that are part of what we call the immune system.
Mhm.
Your body has developed, human bodies have developed a system designed to recognize and respond to different kinds of pathogens, that's bacteria or viruses or parasites, very specifically. And that's really important because it's the memory. So, for instance, if you'd gotten a particular form of influenza, your body's developed a response against that kind of influenza. And those protective responses help the body to clear the viral infection initially, and then immunological memory protects you against that infection in the future. And we see
Mhm.
that with COVID, right? I mean, the common statement is that once you've gotten COVID, you're protected against reinfection. Now we know that that's not entirely true, and you may not be protected against the variants, but against the original strain, you have some level of protection for a period of time, and that's memory. And vaccines help us to understand that.
Mhm.
But we haven't spent a lot of time um, dissecting those responses. And I think one of the things that HIV has taught us is that the development of a vaccine for HIV has been very complicated, but it has given us a tremendous insight into biology and what modern science can do to understand
Mhm.
those protective responses, how to improve them, how to strengthen them. And we very rapidly transitioned a lot of that technology into the development of the COVID-19 vaccine. So if you look at the scientists who are doing work in COVID, many of them are HIV vaccine scientists who've been recycled in a
Right.
sense.
Right. Um, while we're on HIV, maybe I'll ask the question I've always wondered. There's a therapeutic regimen to control HIV, right? So that people with HIV are pretty normal and functional and all of that. But it's been more than 30 years since HIV became a major concern. Well, why is it taking so long to develop an HIV vaccine, whereas, Pfizer, Moderna, others developed a COVID-19 vaccine within less than a year, right? Matter of months.
Yeah, that's another really interesting question. I remember back in February of last year, I was giving talks on vaccine development, and COVID fell into what I call the classic category of pathogens. Classic in the sense that it infects you, um, it runs its course, and if you survive the infection, you're protected against reinfection. That means that your body's immune response, the defensive response, initially responds to the virus, controls it, then eliminates it. And that same response protects you against reinfection. That's a classic pathogen. That's what happens, for instance, with measles. Um, and that's important because those classic pathogens are relatively easier to develop vaccines for. And
Right,
COVID fell into that
right.
category. And I think experience has proved us right. 10 vaccines currently that hit phase 3, 10 vaccines
Hmm.
have been shown to be safe and efficacious. With HIV and, for instance, TB, um, human immune responses are not curative. They don't eliminate the infection. In the case of TB, they wall it off and you live with it for a long time. Hopefully, it never comes out again. And your human immune response, but it never completely eradicates it. With HIV, the human immune response never catches up. You get infected by a single virus. Within a period of about 4 weeks, that virus is now present in millions of different forms. And the human immune system is confused and a bit slow. And it makes a response against what it thinks is the HIV that is causing the problem right now. Right. And by the time that immune response emerges, the virus has mutated and turned into something else.
Right.
So that basically there may be one person who was cured by herself. Her body ended up eliminating the infection, but everyone else who's been infected with HIV will continue to live with it until they die. And that means that vaccine development will be complicated also. Now, we do have some insights now, potentially, into what we call broadly neutralizing antibody and the development of vaccines that will induce that. But that has been a very, very difficult development cycle. And we're just starting the phase 1 trials of those vaccine candidates now. And hopefully they'll make a difference.
Well, well, as terrible as the SARS-2 pandemic has been, I guess we should be grateful the virus is not like the non-classical HIV virus, or else we'd all be
small mercies.
Serious trouble. Small mercies, right? Well, that's a fascinating introduction. Let me ask you about the IVI. I see that it was established in 1997. As the world's only UN-registered treaty-based international organization devoted exclusively to developing and introducing new and improved vaccines to protect the world's poorest people, I think especially children in developing countries. So one of my questions is, why was it set up at that time? And why was it located in Seoul at that time? Having an economics background, 1997 was the year of the Asian financial crisis. And nevertheless, the UN picked Seoul as the location for the IVI, say, instead of Singapore or maybe some other place, Tokyo, that wasn't directly involved in the Asian financial crisis. But at any rate, how did the IVI wind up in Seoul, Korea?
Yeah, it's a story that actually goes back into the 1980s. But a group of scientists decided that vaccine technology ought to benefit children around the world and not just children in the high-income countries. And so they formed something called the Children's Vaccine Initiative, CVI, and the Rockefeller Foundation was a major supporter of that effort initially. And then the United Nations Development Program became involved. And in the 1990s, someone floated an idea that we should have an institute that develops vaccines that will benefit children around the world in the same way that CVI was trying to do for the vaccines that already existed. And so they put out a request for proposals. The aim was to put the institute into a country in Asia, and a country that was not necessarily a high-income country. So back in the 1990s, Korea's economy was still emerging. And so Korea, Thailand, India, all put forward proposals. And in the end, Korea offered to build the building, to donate the land, and to provide a third of the operating costs of the new institute. And when you talk to the people in Korea who helped to set it up, and that includes actually the former Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, who was a senior foreign affairs person at the time, the president of Seoul National University, Jo Won-kyu, and the vice president for research at that university, Sang-Baek Park, they had this vision of an institute that would not only develop vaccines, but potentially help the Korean vaccine and biotechnology industry in its development. And it's been actually kind of farsighted. We do actually work significantly with the Korean biotech industry, with industries all over the world. And I think we add value to the existing infrastructure in Korea by bringing in new technologies, by having vaccines that we can transfer to potentially to Korean companies, by helping those companies do clinical trials overseas, in the same way that we help Indian companies, or hopefully soon Chinese companies, Chinese companies to do COVID vaccine work in countries outside of China. So IVI had this mission, and Korea thought that it was important to have an international organization headquartered in Korea, because at that point there were none. So IVI is the first, and they were emerging. They were entering the OECD, and this was unfortunately the year before the financial crisis struck. And of course, the Korea was awarded the institute. And on one of the first days that the institute had been open, UNDP, United Nations Development Program, pulled out. And then, of course, the Asian crisis hit. And Korea was left with an organization that it had intended to fund, but one of the other funders had pulled out. And so it was not an easy time. But luckily, that's the beginning of the time when the Gates Foundation began its big investment in global health. And one of the first large grants that IVI received was for something called DOMI. And actually, Bill Gates Sr. wrote a single-page letter that said, here's $50 million or $40 million to work on diseases of the most impoverished, DOMI, and send us an update every now and then. And that was it. We don't get Gates Foundation grants like that anymore.
Oh no, we don't either. So
but it was important, and it allowed IVI to really begin the exploration of these diseases of the most impoverished. And cholera is one of those diseases. Typhoid is another one of those diseases. And when you look at our early vaccine target, they were directed by some of the work in understanding the burden of these diseases in the developing world, and it was critical and very helpful.
Yeah, those are that was a very wise grant that the Bill Gates Foundation gave. So in terms of the membership, I see that IVI's membership consists of 36 member states as well as the WHO. But of those, not counting South Korea, there were only 3 other advanced economies: Finland, Israel, and Sweden. And then of the so-called BRICS, the big emerging market economies, Brazil is a member, China is a member, India is a member, but Russia is not. So what drives membership, and what are the obligations and benefits the country has of membership in the IVI?
Yes, so we're in the international organization. Identity is important, but it unfortunately wasn't emphasized sufficiently in the run-up to 2021. So we had those countries. We've gone to several countries, including the Netherlands and others, to see if they would join. And it's been very difficult to convince countries that it's in their interest to help with the development of these vaccines for global health. To some extent, we were, and I think in part due to the work that we'd done with Indian companies, the Indian government became a funder of IVI, joining Korea and Sweden. Sweden has been a long supporter. I mean, they really do believe in a global health and development, and that vaccines play an important role in that. And then last year during COVID, Finland joined. This is despite multiple attempts to, for instance, convince the government of the United Kingdom, or France, or Germany, Australia, to become funders. I think we're making a lot of progress, though, because President Moon and the former foreign minister, Kang, were very instrumental in raising IVI up in discussions that they were having with foreign leaders around the COVID crisis. And so I think that was one of the reasons that Finland decided to join, and actually now a number of larger countries, we would say G7 countries, are thinking about how they might interact with IVI. So in terms of obligations, a country can belong to IVI the international organization
Hmm.
without actually having to make any contributions. And what we're aiming to do next is to set up a system that will allow us to have something like a General Assembly,
Hmm.
um, where the countries that fund IVI actually are allowed seats on our board of trustees, which happens currently. So there are actually five different country
Hmm.
representatives who sit on the board of IVI
Hmm.
and help us make decisions around strategy, around operationalization of the different things that we do, and around very important choices like
Hmm.
uh, the, the potential creation of an IVI office in Europe.
Hmm. Right. Okay. I didn't hear the United States mentioned. It's one of those countries that it could be considering joining IVI. What's going on with the U.S.? Did Minister Kang Kyung-hwa approach the U.S. or do you know?
In fact, the U.S. has been a long target, and as a former U.S. military person
Yeah.
who has worked in global health, it would be wonderful. The U.S. has difficulty sometimes joining treaty-based international organizations.
Right.
It hasn't recognized the Convention or Treaty of Vienna, which is the standard convention for international organizations.
Mm.
Because Senate ratification is required for entry under a treaty-based organization, the U.S. has difficulty. And in fact, in the beginning, when IVI was founded, a vice president at Merck wrote a letter to the Secretary of State saying that IVI was going to steal intellectual property from U.S. companies and manufacture their vaccines in kind of a knockoff fashion. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, now the Constitution has been amended specifically to say that we would respect intellectual property. Of course, everything we do at the Gates Foundation carries with it the obligations that the Gates Foundation makes to companies regarding intellectual property. And, eventually, by about 2009, the US had decided that it wasn't such an issue. But John Clements, the first Director General, tells a story where the US ambassador called him up and said, "You are a traitor, and we are going to revoke your passport and get you out of Korea." And it took the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Donna Shalala, to actually reverse that. And I think it's a wonderful story because it gets to the idea that even the United States is conflicted in a sense, and the support of people in the U.S. government has been critical for IVI to exist. But our ability to count the U.S. as a potential funder has been limited, even though one of the U.S. ambassadors here actually recommended that the U.S. join IVI.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad to hear that because the Korea Society has many ambassadors and has had many ambassadors, both as chair and presidents. So maybe one of the good ambassadors was the one who recommended joining. We won't go into names. Maybe that'll be too,
No.
it could be embarrassing. Well, that's really fascinating because I know the U.S. is reluctant to join treaties. A lot of decisions, particularly in the past 2 or 3 presidencies, have been made by executive order. And even with the law of the sea, the U.S. is not a signatory to the treaty-based law of the sea. Just to wrap up on the IVI, so your funding comes in from foundations, mainly the Gates Foundation. Do countries make contributions? Member countries make contributions as well?
Yes. So the Korean government is our largest funder,
Right.
followed by then Sweden, India, and Finland.
Okay.
About a quarter of our total budget comes from state funders,
Right.
and the remainder is from project-driven grants from foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Wellcome Trust,
Right.
or from organizations like CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations.
Right.
And that's very important. So, of our, let's see, roughly this year, $50 million budget, 3/4 comes from project-driven grants from
I get it. Right.
organizations.
Right. Okay. Good. A bit more on the work of the IVI. I see it has 3 fundamental components: vaccine R&D, partnerships, and capacity building. You talked about some of the vaccine work you've been doing, cholera, uh, another one. But what could you tell us more about your vaccine R&D work?
Okay. Vaccine development, and I think you've probably heard this, different commentators making this statement during the COVID crisis. Under traditional circumstances, it takes 5 to 10 years to develop a vaccine. It costs a big company like Merck or GSK $1 billion on average to develop a
Mhm.
vaccine. And their failure rate from lab to licensure is about 90%.
Mm.
So IVI, as a small international organization that develops vaccines, is at a bit of a disadvantage because we usually don't have $1 billion to develop a vaccine. So
Right.
um, what we've been able to do is find a kind of lower cost model that allows us to move vaccines from our laboratory all the way through the clinical testing in humans, approval, and the creation of stockpiles and incentives for much lower costs. So the oral cholera vaccine cost the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation from lab to licensure, actually 3 licensures, $28 million. The typhoid conjugate vaccine, the application for approval is now in front of the Ministry for Food and Drug Safety in Korea. Was estimated to cost the Gates Foundation $33 million, but actually we have to return $4 million because we don't need it.
Mm.
So, our model for developing vaccines is lower cost
Mhm.
than the standard model. And it's the Bill and Melinda Gates funds lots of vaccine research.
Mhm.
Actually, only 2 organizations have successfully taken vaccines from the laboratory to licensure: IVI and another organization called PATH. And I think that's a very important point to make. Many biotech companies never get to the point where they have a licensed product,
Right.
but IVI has one and hopefully soon two licensed vaccines. And now our board authorized work on a third vaccine. So, we call it, the project was called vaccine number 3. It actually has 2 different vaccines that we're working on. And now, in addition to the IVI funding for that, the Wellcome Trust has kicked in funding for both of those vaccines. So again, we do owe a lot to the vision of some of the funding organizations like the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome
Mhm.
Trust.
Right. Well, that's an amazing accomplishment. Congratulations. Um, Other than your leadership in all this, how else do you explain your ability to go from laboratory to a successful vaccine? I mean, what type of researchers do you hire? Where do they come from? How do you staff the IVI?
So let's see, IVI currently has about 175 people, although
Hmm.
we're thinking that by the end of the year, we may be close to 200.
Hmm.
Roughly 80% are Korean nationals, although that number changes from day to day.
Hmm.
We have 29 international staff from I
Hmm.
think 19 different countries now.
Right.
We work primarily through the headquarters in Seoul, but with
Hmm.
significant collaborations with countries around the world. 28 different countries now around
Hmm.
the world have IVI projects going on in
Right.
them currently.
Right.
Historically, I think the number is up to 75 countries
Hmm.
around the world. We tend to like to execute projects or have our local collaborators execute the project and have ownership of it. What we
Hmm.
don't want is for this to be an IVI project.
Right.
We want
Hmm.
a successful project in Ghana to be run, staffed by Ghanaians,
Mm.
because it's a part of our responsibility
Mm.
as an organization to do capacity building.
Right. Hmm.
Um, in addition to the staff that we have, our strategy was first to do this sustainably,
Hmm.
which meant that we had to firm up relationships with our stakeholders and be relevant to them. So if our stakeholders, say the government of Korea, said, we need you to work on vaccine for X, then we would say, okay, then we will start work on that
Right.
if we can, if there's funding available. And the final thing is not only capacity building, but having the right people. So if you imagine IVI is a bit like a biotech company that develops a vaccine from the laboratory all the way through approval, we need the kind of people that are present in a biotech or in a small
Hmm.
vaccine manufacturer in order to move those products along. We need people who can work in the lab. We need people who can develop the testing of that vaccine in humans. We need someone who can transfer that technology to a manufacturer, a real manufacturer who can actually make the vaccine. And then we need people on the other end to be able to help with implementation research. So I think you're familiar with COVID. We did these large phase 3 trials, and now countries around the world are using the vaccine. And some countries are trying to figure out, is the vaccine really doing what it's supposed to do? Will it work as well in the real world as it did in the clinical trials? And so that implementation research is actually really critical, because in the end, we have to convince not a Ministry of Health. The Ministries of Health usually believe in vaccines. The ministries of finance that have to pay for it aren't such big supporters. And so we have to generate data that there's actually a benefit to vaccination. And so, part of IVI does that. So we're like an one-stop shop, in essence, for vaccine development. And that's a really critical part of what we are and what we do. And that's, I think, it's not me. It's the people who write grants, who execute the grants, and who are able to take our capabilities and translate them into products that will have impact for global health.
Right. Well, it's again, that's it's a lot of moving parts to organize, and it takes, I think, a lot of good managerial skill to pull all this together. So it's really amazing. I'd like to ask one more side question, maybe to educate myself as well as the audience. You mentioned that the phase 3 trials, these clinical trials, are not quite the same thing as the results in the real world. So that's efficacy versus effectiveness in vaccine. Aren't the clinical trials done in the real world? I know there's a placebo involved, but what's the difference between a large clinical trial that includes 30,000 subjects or more, and real world experience?
So clinical trials, particularly those that are destined for licensure, with the FDA in the United States and EMA in Europe, or the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety in Korea, are conducted to an international standard for quality called GCP or ICH, the International Committee for Harmonization. And that, because countries realized that vaccine companies, in order to have their products be effective, needed a set of rules around the execution of clinical trials, around quality for manufacturing, and around quality for the lab work that supports licensure. And so these we call them the GXPs because it's GCP, GMP, GLP. And these quality guidelines are really critical. So, for instance, when the World Health Organization is looking at the Sinopharm vaccine, the Chinese vaccine that was just approved for emergency use listing, it is going to require that Sinopharm meet the same requirements under the ICH for that an American company or a European company has to make. And that way we can assure people around the world, countries, that the vaccines that are developed by Sinopharm meet the necessary requirements for approval and use and purchase by UN agencies. So a phase 3 trial is designed according to those rules. And it's designed to remove all the biases. So you really are interested in protection of an individual person. Does the vaccine protect the individual person from COVID-19? And if it does that, we're trying to strip away the possibility of biases. So we blind the investigators. So they don't know whether the volunteers received vaccine or placebo. When they come back in, the nurses don't know, and they're complaining about something. Like, say they got a shot of either vaccine or placebo, and the next day they complain of a headache. The nurses don't know whether they've gotten one or the other, so they accurately report their finding. Subject X received vaccination yesterday and now report the headache of grade 3 severity. And it won't be biased by whether they thought the vaccine worked or didn't work. And so clinical trials are designed that way very specifically. And the way we collect data, if you were supposed to come back on day 21 for your Pfizer vaccine and you came back on day 28, well, you are not going to be counted in the same way because you are not following the protocol.
Right.
because these
Right.
protocols are really critical part of the scientific
Right.
understanding of how the vaccine is working
Mm.
to protect. Um, in the real world, oh, and the other part is the vaccine itself. In a clinical trial, if it says the vaccine has to be stored at the temperature of liquid of dry ice, we are going to do everything possible to make sure that at every step along the way,
Hmm.
that temperature was maintained. And if it wasn't, we'll discard the doses.
Hmm.
Now, when you get to the real world, you're going to be vaccinating older people and younger people. You're going to vaccinate them maybe outside the recommended window. You may be largely following the temperature controls, but you won't have the same kind of rigid
Hmm.
use of the temperature controls that we would use in a clinical trial. And, everyone receives a vaccine. So any biases for or against the vaccine are going to be captured.
Hmm.
So, for instance, and this is maybe a funny story, but the Johnson and Johnson vaccine, because it's a single dose, I think some of the people who wanted to receive it are people who don't like needles, so they only have to get a single shot. But there is a group of people who passed out when they got their single shot, um, and we know that they got the Johnson and Johnson vaccine. So is Johnson and Johnson the fainting vaccine? Probably not. But again, this is something
Hmm.
that gets recorded and reported, and
Right.
in a
Right.
real world situation, and something that may not happen in a volunteer situation because the nurses told you could get this, it's a single shot, you could experience pain. I mean, you go through this set of things that you have to do for every volunteer in order to explain very well to
Mm.
help them understand the risk they're taking as a volunteer.
Mm.
So the real world data is really important though, because what if we had a vaccine like an RNA vaccine that needed to be kept cold, and we started to use it in Democratic Republic of Congo, where it might be difficult to maintain the cold chain,
Mhm.
and it might be difficult to bring people back for their second shot at 21 days.
Right.
And so we need to know how the vaccine works,
Mm.
and sometimes we're surprised, as we are with some of the results now coming out with the Pfizer vaccine. It works better at 3 months than it does if you give the two doses 21 days apart.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, well, that's I certainly learned a lot in that response. Well, let me just follow up with one quick question. Do we know, is the real world data out there, so that are there any significant discrepancies between the clinical data and the real world data on the vaccines that have been widely used since, say, the end of last year?
yeah, I think that the one thing is, everyone gets fixated on the efficacy.
Right.
And those vaccines that are 95% efficacious and safe, like the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine is 94.5. The
Mhm.
Gamaleya vaccine, I think, reported 92%. And then you have vaccines like the Sinovac vaccine, the Chinese vaccine,
Mhm.
where efficacy was maybe above 50% in some cases in Brazil, and maybe up to mid 60s%
Mhm.
overall. And people are saying, well, that vaccine's not very good. Um, but in fact, effectiveness is a different measure.
Right.
Effectiveness is information that the countries want. Does the vaccine keep people out of the hospital, off a ventilator, and keep them from dying? And those are the key questions for a
Mhm.
country. So if you got the Sinovac vaccine and you could still get COVID-19 infection, but it was a mild thing like a cold, most people could live with that. What they want to see is a dramatic reduction in hospitalization, ventilators, and death. And in fact, all of the vaccines that we have currently do a really good job at effectiveness. They keep people
Mhm.
out of the hospital and they keep people from dying.
Mhm.
And so you'll see, with the Sinovac vaccine, the effectiveness could be in the mid 80s, um, really different from the efficacy that was reported.
Right.
So again, it may allow us to look at other kinds of vaccines. The
Right.
AstraZeneca vaccine reported efficacy initially of 60%. Um, in the US, it was higher than that.
Mhm.
In other parts of the world, South Africa, it was lower than that. But when you've implemented AstraZeneca vaccine in the country, we start to see
Mhm.
significant reductions in the number of hospitalizations.
Right.
And that's what you want as a country.
Right.
You don't want your hospitals to be full of people on ventilators with COVID-19. and because those are the people at risk for dying.
Right. Right. Just wrapping up with the work of the IVI partnerships. What's your institutional relationship with the COVAX initiative?
So, so IVI doesn't work specifically with COVAX. We
Right.
have, advocated for it. We've
Hmm.
encouraged countries to join and support COVAX.
Right.
I'm not sure if any of that advocacy work made any difference, but it's a critical idea because for IVI, I mentioned the case of rotavirus vaccine. This
Hmm.
is a vaccine that's unbelievably effective,
Hmm.
and 15 years after it was approved in the U.S., 60% of children around the world don't get it.
Hmm.
With COVAX, we have the opportunity to, for the first time, introduce new vaccine technology in the same year to low, middle, and high income countries. And if
Hmm.
we can make it work and make sure that countries
Hmm.
can count on it, then maybe this is one of the very few silver linings in the COVID cloud.
Right.
Maybe this is something that will allow us to get other vaccines, like the pneumonia vaccine
Right.
that you received, out and used in countries around the world, irrespective of their income, more quickly than we do currently.
Hmm. Right. Um, okay. Uh, and just the follow up to that. So, if you're not working directly with COVAX, that's very much involved in providing SARS-2 vaccines to developing countries and some developing countries. And even I understand COVAX has a program kind of like Operation Warp Speed in the US, where it's funding the development of vaccines. Um, but if you're not working directly with COVAX on SARS-2, are you doing anything else directly with fighting the SARS-2 pandemic?
Yes. So COVAX actually has three components,
Okay.
and one of the components is known as CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations.
Right.
And actually, the U.S. has finally joined CEPI, thanks
Okay.
to the Biden administration, which is
Hmm.
great. But CEPI was set up in the aftermath of Ebola to make sure that we had a mechanism to develop vaccines quickly. So even before Operation Warp Speed, CEPI started, I think, maybe 3 weeks after the initial announcement of the sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. CEPI placed some bets. They funded companies like Moderna,
Hmm.
Novavax, Oxford University, whose vaccine was eventually transferred to AstraZeneca, to develop their vaccines. And they put a significant hundreds of millions of dollars worth of funding on this. And really, before Operation Warp Speed, the funding from CEPI was really critical in advancing some of these vaccine candidates into human testing as quickly as we could. And IVI is working with CEPI. So I guess
Okay.
in a roundabout way, we are working at COVAX. CEPI is funding work that IVI is doing potentially with a small Chinese company named Clover, which is starting its phase 3 testing of a new COVID-19 vaccine. And as well, we're working with companies that have received funding from CEPI for other reasons, for other vaccine candidates. And so, we are, in a sense, working with CEPI to develop vaccines for COVID-19.
Okay.
All in all, IVI is working with 14 different companies with signed contracts and in discussions with many
Right.
more. And our goal during COVID was not to develop our own vaccine,
Hmm.
but to offer IVI services. Again, remember, we're a one-stop shop. A lot of the smaller companies don't have all the components necessary in order to develop and test vaccines, where
Hmm.
we can help them. So we're doing a human clinical trial with the Inovio DNA vaccine in
Hmm.
Korea. We're also working with a Korean company called Genexin to do its clinical trial in Korea, but not by recruiting volunteers, but by doing the kind of testing necessary for Genexin's clinical data to be presented to a regulatory agency. And again, there are quality rules under what we call GCLP
Hmm.
um, that companies have to follow in order to have their data recognized
Hmm.
as being of good quality by regulatory agencies, and IVI is capable of doing that. So some companies don't have the kind of animal facilities needed to test COVID vaccines, so they give the animal the vaccine, and then they challenge the animal with COVID-19.
Mhm.
Well, that requires a very high level of biosafety. And IVI has an animal facility that can do that. So a lot of the work that we've done
Mhm.
supporting even companies that make monoclonal antibodies has been to
Right.
use our facilities to do challenges, to do a proof of principle, to see if the vaccine actually protects against infection or causes the infection to go away more quickly.
Right. Right. Okay. Um, Going back to this, the how clinical trials they have to abide by certain globally recognized standards. Um, I see that the WHO now approves, or at least of last week, 6 vaccines for emergency use, and Sinopharm was probably the most recent one, right? Okay, so that's 6 vaccines, but the U.S. FDA has approved only 3: Pfizer, um, BioNTech, and Moderna, and Janssen. Not AstraZeneca, which is approved by the WHO and it's in widespread use globally, while South Korea has not yet approved Moderna. Um, what accounts for this hodgepodge of approvals among countries and the WHO? And is this an impediment to the global vaccination drive?
It is. And I think that one of the nice things, so imagine, there are 200 plus countries around the world.
Yeah.
Not all of them have an FDA that is capable
Mhm.
of taking the data from a
Mhm.
company and reviewing it
Mhm.
in an expedited fashion with great technical competence
Right.
around the interpretation of data
Mhm.
or inspection of facilities to make sure that the facilities are actually meeting the quality standards necessary
Mhm.
in order to produce vaccines
Right.
that are safe and efficacious. In fact, around the world, there are just a few what we call stringent regulatory authorities. That would include the FDA, the UK's regulator called MHRA, the
Right.
EMA in
Mhm.
Europe. The many of the well, not many. There are a few additional that are considered functional, so the one step lower, but fully able to review a dossier. That is all the
Mhm.
submitted paperwork that a company provides as proof that it can actually that the vaccine is safe and efficacious,
Mhm.
and also are capable of doing the inspections necessary in order to ensure that the manufacturing
Mhm.
meets the quality standards set forth um, under the ICH. So those functional regulatory authorities are very important because those are the vaccines, like the Sinopharm vaccine. China's regulatory authorities considered functional,
Mhm.
that can be referred to WHO for review.
Mhm.
What gets really complicated is, the smaller countries.
Mhm.
So if you were in a small country in Latin America, you might not have a regulatory authority that is fully capable of doing the things that the FDA does or that
Mhm.
the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety in Korea does.
Mhm.
And so, how would you be able to interpret data? Well, you're going to depend on the WHO. WHO approval, and there are examples of other vaccines where if they don't have that approval, despite having large outbreaks of a disease in the country,
Mhm.
the country will not authorize the use of the vaccine
Mhm.
because it doesn't have the requisite um, blessing from WHO.
Mhm.
Um, for Korea, it's a little bit different. The Koreans are approving vaccines as they become available for use in Korea, and
Mhm.
part of the reason is the amount of work that COVID-19 has created for these organizations. So if you're the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety or the FDA, typically it takes a year to review well, in the past it was a trailer truck full of documents. Now it's all submitted electronically, but it takes a long time for you to go through that page by page, develop the questions, get answers back from the company. Under COVID, these regulatory agencies are working around the clock
Mhm.
in order to make sure that approvals that would normally take a month are done in a few weeks,
Mhm.
sometimes a few days. That the review of the final review for emergency use, rather than being a year long, is done within a month of submission of the initial interim
Mhm.
data. So they're completely overwhelmed. In fact, for us, we know Ministry of Food and Drug Safety is delaying review of one of the applications for approval for a non-COVID product because it's so occupied with
Right.
COVID-19. So it is a little complicated. The WHO review, I think, assures countries around the world that this vaccine meets the necessary standards. And hopefully, the Sinovac vaccine, the Sputnik 5 vaccine from Gamaleya will also meet those standards and be available for and provide some level of assurance to countries around the world. The other point that WHO approval serves as a gateway, a gatekeeper for entry into COVAX. So until it's approved by WHO, it can't be purchased into COVAX. And so that's a very important step because many countries around the world are still depending on the doses that they can receive through this COVAX facility.
Right. Okay. Okay. With some of the, I'm just reading in the press, so I don't know how accurate this information is, but two of the most highly vaccinated countries, Seychelles and Chile, don't seem to be doing as well as reducing the infection rates, the hospitalization rates as other countries that are fairly well documented. Is that are you knowledgeable about that situation? Is there anything to be concerned about?
So it's interesting. There was a private release of information from one of the Chilean universities that was not official. And when the Chilean government presented its effectiveness data, it actually looked like the vaccines might be more effective than was suggested in that original statement. Again, the issue is the reduction in hospitalizations, and there were significant reductions in hospitalization associated with the vaccination. I think it was the Sinovac vaccine. Indonesia reported amazing effectiveness data, vaccinating 23 or 25,000 healthcare workers. So again, these are real world data. In the Seychelles, it's difficult to know because right now we don't know the breakdown of the people being hospitalized. I mean, the important point is, of course, that vaccination doesn't necessarily, it does prevent some infections. And in those people that it doesn't prevent the infection with COVID-19, it actually decreases the risk of hospitalization and death.
Right.
And so, and again, this is all anecdotal from the newspapers as well. The president of the Seychelles said, what we don't know is who's been vaccinated and who hasn't been. I think that the people in the hospital are the 40% of the people of the Seychelles who are not vaccinated. 80% of the people in the hospitals have not received vaccine versus 20% who have. So again, hard to know. And I think countries are and the WHO are probably helping and working with Seychelles in order to generate very important data around whether the vaccine is working or not.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good to know, to have your expert insight and judgment on all that. Some of these press reports are very press stories are very alarming, perhaps unnecessarily so. And a question I often get asked is, in fact, some people ask me to ask you this, is that how effective are the current vaccines widely in use, say those approved by the US FDA or the WHO, against the variants that are popping up, especially the one in India that I just read recently is spreading into Nepal and causing the same problems that are occurring in India in neighboring Nepal. So the current vaccines, how effective are they against the variants? Do we know?
Yeah. So there are two kinds of ways we can look for information. The first one is actually direct information, vaccines that were tested in the setting of outbreaks with the variants. And we have two vaccines that have that kind of data. One of them is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which was tested in South Africa against the variants. And it appears to be have efficacy against the South African variant. Now, the Indian variant and the South African variant are close enough. But again, no direct evidence of the efficacy in India, but definitely evidence of efficacy in South Africa. And then the Novavax vaccine actually also has data in South Africa. So we do have data supporting efficacious vaccines against the South African variant, which is, I think, the most potentially worrisome of all of them. There is indirect, and I would say indirect, but test tube evidence that the vaccines should protect. And what do? They vaccinate people, they collect blood from those individuals, and they look at the ability of the antibodies, the infection fighting proteins induced by the vaccine in the blood of people who've been vaccinated to neutralize, that is, inactivate the virus, the mutant viruses. And so, so far, Chinese vaccines, the Gamaleya vaccine, and all of the vaccines approved in the United States and Europe appear to be able to cross neutralize, that is, inactivate in a test tube, the different variants. It's not direct evidence. There will be emerging effectiveness data from several countries where vaccination is ongoing and variants are circulating. And the WHO does flag this. For instance, the Sinopharm vaccine. The WHO said that Sinopharm needed to collect more data in areas where variants are circulating, because it's one thing to have test tube data. It's another and very important thing to actually have real data that the vaccine is working as we predict it would.
Right. So if the WHO is approving for emergency use vaccines such as Sinopharm, I don't know if they've gotten to Sinovac already. You can correct me. I just don't know.
Not yet.
Okay, this will help improve the transparency and the data analytical qualities in assessing the effectiveness of these vaccines, right? So it's kind of good to be approved it's good for the general public or the general well-being in fighting this pandemic that the WHO is approving some of these vaccines.
So maybe not as much for people in the United States or in Europe or in countries with these stringent regulatory authorities, because their regulatory authorities are, because they're stringent, are fully capable of analyzing the data that are presented to them. For other countries around the world, again, countries with what we call the next level, functional, also have regulatory authorities that are capable of looking at the data and making a primary decision and verifying the quality of manufacture. But for most of the countries around the world that don't have these functional or stringent regulatory authorities, WHO's endorsement is really critical for two reasons. The first is that it provides a second review on top of, say, the NMPA, the Chinese regulatory authority, or the Korean regulatory authority review. So that's important. But the other part is it allows entry into COVAX. And entry into COVAX typically means that countries around the world that need the vaccine through COVAX will accept it. And again, a very important part of getting as much vaccine out as quickly as possible to as many people as possible, we really need COVAX to function like a mechanism to acquire and distribute vaccine globally. Right.
Moving on to another topic. Recently, the World Trade Organization advocated a temporary vaccine patent waiver for the SARS-2 vaccines. And in the US, the Biden administration, I think, reversed the position of the Trump administration and gave its support to this initiative. Although in Germany, Chancellor Merkel, France, President Macron, and I think the Brazilian authorities are not on board for that. What's your take on this? Will it make a difference in boosting the supply of the vaccine to the developing world on a timely basis? Does it have costs as well as benefits?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, but I think to start with, let's just say, IVI fully supports intellectual property, and really, though, on our own vaccines, we haven't taken out patents yet. On the vaccines for typhoid and cholera, IVI doesn't have patents. What we have is know-how. That is, it's one thing to be able to say, our typhoid conjugate vaccine is, the outer sugar coating of typhoid conjugated to the diphtheria toxin. So I could tell you that, but you still have to make it. And that know-how is critical. So to get more to the question, we will probably be be short of vaccine supply for several months, maybe 6 to 9 months more. But if you look at the projections of companies around the world, and as they're scaling up manufacturing, over the next 6 to 9 months, we will see dramatic increases in the availability of vaccine. The second question then is, will a patent waiver from the United States, in the absence of general agreement at WTO, particularly from other developed countries like Germany, France, and Brazil, really be able to change anything? And the answer to that is no. And even if it were able to do it, would they be able to do a technology transfer? Would a company be able to develop the technology for RNA vaccines in the time frame of 6 to 9 months when vaccine shortages will be most profound? And the answer is no. Why? Because, for instance, so this number may not be accurate. I got it from a newspaper article. The Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine has 50,000 steps. That's not in the patent. So if a company were trying to imitate that product, they would have to come up with those 50,000 steps, all quality controlled. And it may be difficult to do that in 6 to 9 months if all you had was the secret formula for the vaccine itself, because the manufacturing is the issue, and it's the know-how around manufacturing that takes time to transfer. When we transfer a vaccine to a company, we want it to go to a company that has the appropriate levels of quality to be able to take the vaccine, to use it, to manufacture it reproducibly, and in high quality. And then at the same time, we need regulatory authorities like an FDA in a country to be able to review that information and make sure that, and be able to say, yes, we agree. We've done a review. We agree with your data. We agree with your manufacturing. We've done an inspection according to international standards, and you meet all of them. And until you can do that, what will a patent waiver mean, really? And I think that the final issue, and again, remember that IVI is committed to technology transfer to companies around the world to manufacture vaccines. And we really owe a lot of credit to biotech companies, and not necessarily manufacturers, but Pfizer, which is a big vaccine manufacturer, depended on BioNTech, which is a biotech for the RNA vaccine. Moderna is a biotech. AstraZeneca actually doesn't make vaccines except for the COVID vaccine. It got Oxford's vaccine and manufactured it. Novavax is a biotech. Sanofi is working now. I think they're in phase 2, going to phase 3, but they are very far behind, and they're the only other major company involved with the vaccines. Merck pulled out. GSK only volunteered an adjuvant. They don't really have a vaccine candidate of their own. Takeda, another big company, nothing. Daiichi Sankyo, nothing. Serum Institute really is making vaccines for other people. We owe a lot of the success to biotech companies and innovation. And if you were a biotech company and the government said, we need you to give away the secret fatty, so there's a lipid nanoparticle that BioNTech developed that wraps the RNA. Now that lipid nanoparticle can be used in all of BioNTech's vaccines, including the ones that they were trying to develop, for instance, for cancer, which are much bigger markets. But now you're going to ask them to give away that formula. Will BioNTech ever want to help a government in need during a pandemic if they're going to be asked to surrender really critical intellectual property that not only impacts the COVID vaccine, but impacts the development of all of their vaccines? Would a big company want to do it? I mean, they're already kind of apparently a bit skittish about getting involved in the biggest pandemic in 100 years. Thank God for biotechs. And now we might say, well, but it doesn't matter. We're going to waive your rights to this. So there could be unintended consequences. And the time to talk about this is in the interpandemic period. Let's put some real thinking into this and come to consensus around what is and what is not covered by these patent waivers, but not at a time when there's a gun to everyone's head.
Right. So there was a foreign affairs article recently published. The title is "Producing a Vaccine Requires More Than a Patent. Intellectual property is just one piece of an elaborate process." But the intellectual property itself is important for the future development of vaccines, and to keep this very innovative biotech industry alive and well. That in the long run will probably be best for us. Well, that was a very that was a very clear-cut answer. Um, so if developing a vaccine is a complicated and elaborate process, um, President Moon is coming to the United States on the 21st, and there'll be a summit with President Biden. And I understand, in addition to the usual issues of alliance relationships and um, dealing with North Korean threats, this idea of a vaccine partnership will come up, or vaccine diplomacy. Um, and there are some members of the Korean National Assembly who are advocating a vaccine partnership, where there'd be some sort of cooperation between vaccine producers in both countries. Um, would Does Korea have what it takes to become, say, an Asian manufacturing hub for COVID vaccines in this short period of time, 6 to 9 months?
So I think that the short answer is yes, and it really goes back to um, a threat back in 2009 during the last really large pandemic flu outbreak,
Hmm.
where it was clear that the United States might invoke its vaccine nationalism and withhold doses of vaccine that were destined for other countries, citing its own vaccine security needs. And so, armed with that frightening knowledge, the Korean government embarked on a vaccine self-sufficiency program of its own.
Hmm.
And it's really kind of a remarkable effort to be 80% self-sufficient in vaccines by 2025. In response to the threat of a country withholding vaccines, as the
Right.
EU threatened to do, the UK, or
Right.
as actually
Mhm.
India is doing right now. It's withholding vaccine that it's committed to COVAX
Mhm.
because of its own needs.
Right.
So Korea started to develop its own and encourage its own vaccine industry, uh, investing over $300 million in building these pilot production plants in Andong and Hwasun that make different kinds of vaccines, developing vaccine development programs that the government is funding. And I think that it really shows up. 300 million doses of the Sputnik 5 vaccine are being manufactured by a consortium of companies in Korea. The AstraZeneca vaccine is being manufactured by SK Bioscience. The Novavax vaccine is also being manufactured by SK Bioscience. Again, indicative of the level of quality that SK Bioscience is known to put
Right.
into its vaccine manufacture, and its ability to turn around multiple vaccines quickly under
Mhm.
contract.
Right.
There was actually a newspaper article on Moderna having a deal, and I think it said Samsung Biologics, but someone else, there was some other article that said it might be Hanmi. Um, Again, recognition that Korean bioscience or biotechnology um, companies are able to very rapidly turn around a very high quality product.
Right.
So I think that Korea is a good partner. SK Bioscience actually 2 years ago now, licensed its flu vaccine to Sanofi.
Mhm.
And Sanofi, again, major
Mhm.
vaccine manufacturer, went to SK for assistance in developing this new pneumonia vaccine that Sanofi had difficulty developing on its own. So I think that Korean vaccine companies have capability. They have manufacturing expertise. They can do things quickly and at high quality. And these are products, for instance, the collaboration with Sanofi, that will have to meet FDA approval. So
Mhm.
again, um, the ability to operate, to be to be a fast follower, maybe,
Mhm.
but also to innovate independently, I think are going to be things that will serve Korea well. And you know, they're across the road from each other in near the Incheon airport are
Right.
Celltrion and Samsung Biologics.
Right.
Probably about 40 or 50% of the world's production of monoclonal antibodies happens in that 2 square block area of
Mhm.
Songdo.
Right.
A really remarkable development in a country that, where brand new monoclonal antibodies aren't made, but most of the world's contract
Mhm.
manufacturing of monoclonal
Mhm.
antibodies happens. So again, I think Korea has a lot to contribute potentially, um, and it would serve the United States well, knowing that they were having problems, with some of the contract manufacturing done, for instance, at Emergent. So an opportunity.
Right. Right. So it sounds like South Korea could become a vaccine hub, and at the same time, intellectual property would be protected, so we don't have to go down that route. So the biotech companies would be happy
Right.
cooperating with South Korea. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Um, I have two more questions. One is it's received a lot of attention in the press and the Congress here in the U.S., but also in the scientific community with yeah, a letter submitted to the journal Science by scientists. So, what is the origin of the SARS-2 virus? I understand this is critical for informing global strategies to mitigate risks of future outbreaks. Um, did it come from a wild animal to man or from a laboratory to man? Do we have any understanding of that? I know that Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the WHO, said that as far as the WHO is concerned, all hypotheses remain on the table, and the WHO will leave no stone unturned to find that out. So, what's the level of understanding? What does it look like?
So, and this is my personal opinion.
Right.
I didn't serve on the WHO working group, but
Mhm.
we know that the coronaviruses are capable of making the great leap from animals to humans, like some other
Mhm.
viruses. We know that there are viruses that look very similar to SARS-CoV-2 that exist in bats, and maybe there was another animal in between the leap into
Mhm.
humans, but we haven't been able to identify it yet. It might even be that there are multiple introductions of SARS-CoV-2 like viruses
Mhm.
over time, but it just so happened that the unique circumstances of a transmission event that occurred in Wuhan was the penultimate event to the pandemic.
Right.
But we don't have the data from that time, and we don't have the smoking gun.
Right.
Um, but we do know that the Middle East respiratory syndrome outbreak in Korea is an example. The SARS-CoV-1 outbreak in Asia and other places around the world in the early 2000s is another example. Coronaviruses, making the leap and causing significant concern. So that being said, could there have been a laboratory experiment that leaked out and spilled over? And again, scientists don't deal necessarily in certainties, but in probabilities. So we would say unlikely but possible. And that's been translated into by some people. Well, of course they did.
Mhm.
And I think that again, we need to be objective, and
Right.
and that may mean that there needs to be a panel acceptable to multiple groups, including the Chinese government, that is able to do an investigation. And if there was a lab leak, then there need to be strengthened rules around the handling of microorganisms
Mhm.
that are potentially dangerous or have pathogen
Mhm.
consequences for humans.
Mhm.
There should also be restrictions around what we call gain of use funding. So,
Right.
understanding how a virus will need to mutate itself in order to make the efficient leap
Mhm.
into humans is something that you might want to do because you might want to know how to protect yourself against those very pathogens.
Right.
But the rules around that and the disclosure of that kind of work and the documentation that's necessary in order to do that is something that you could look at and perhaps strengthen
Mhm.
through an international agreement.
Right.
Maybe again, one of the post-pandemic things. At this point, does it matter if it leaked out of a Chinese laboratory or um, you know uh, made a great leap from bats to pangolins to humans? No, because we have to deal with the consequences of the outbreak.
Right.
Do
Mhm.
we have time to look for these other things? Yes, we do.
Right.
But again, it's going to be difficult to go into a high level containment laboratory in China and demand to see everything. I mean, the same
Mhm.
thing would be true if the Chinese demanded to go to, our National Biodefense Laboratory, Fort Detrick, and demand to look at everything.
Mhm.
So I think that there needs to be an agreement, and it doesn't have to be an agreement that makes everyone upset. It should be an agreement. If we want cooperation and we want to get to the bottom of this,
Right,
and we want to prevent it in the future, then there has to be
right,
alignment on the objectives, on the findings, and on the mitigation that's put into
right,
place.
right, right. So the both hypotheses are still unproven, uh, right?
Right. Right.
Animal to man, laboratory to man.
No, I think
Um,
we're pretty clear that it. I mean, it started in bats, presumably,
okay,
and its pathway into humans we may never completely understand. I mean, for instance, with HIV, another disease that I'm very familiar with, there probably have been multiple introductions from
right,
chimpanzees into humans over the course of the last century. But it's the unique combination of events that led to the outbreaks in Africa that probably resulted in the current
right,
HIV pandemic.
right.
Um, and do we actually know? I mean, we've been investigating this for almost 40 years. Um, have we been able to put our finger on, the chimpanzee that was killed, that transmitted the disease to the human
Mhm,
that was
mhm,
infected? No. So again, important to understand scientifically,
mhm,
not of consequence for the current outbreak,
right,
potentially of use and value for future prevention of future outbreaks.
right. Okay. Well, um, it's very good to hear that you have very, your opinion on this and inform us of the complications involved in trying to trace the origins of all these viruses. Um, which probably leads me to the last question I have. What can the Korea Society do to help? We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization established in 1957. Um, what role can we play more than we're already doing in shedding light on the good work that IVI is doing, to improve the health and welfare of people in developing countries, even beyond dealing with the SARS-2 pandemic.
Yes. So thanks for that question. IVI is trying to build a program that increases the exposure of IVI and its work to potential funders and donors. Like the Gates Foundation. I mean, Bill and
Mhm.
Melinda Gates are not the only people who have an interest in global health, and our ability to work on vaccines of interest. So, for instance, one of my pet vaccines, my favorite vaccines to talk about, is a vaccine against Group A strep. Now, you'll say, "Oh, what's that?" It causes strep throat. And in the United States, because we have good health care and access to antibiotics, very few people come down with the dreaded complication. Um,
Mhm.
so, in a few people who get that infection and are not treated, the infection spreads to the heart and causes an inflammation of the heart and the heart valves. And over time, repeated untreated group A strep infections cause a degeneration of the heart valves, leading to heart failure. Now, you think, well, that doesn't sound very common, but actually, worldwide, 300,000 people die from heart failure complications caused by the group A strep. Um, at the same time, group A strep causes a lot of skin infections. And so another 150 to 200,000 people a year die from that. The flesh eating bacteria is often group A strep.
Ah,
We don't have a vaccine against it.
mhm.
And, a vaccine like that might prevent 500,000 deaths a year. I mean, we really need to convince a donor that this is a vaccine, or there are vaccine candidates that we'd really like to test. Um, but the Gates Foundation isn't interested. And in the absence of that kind of funding, you do a small grant. You wait
Mhm.
another year, you may get another grant. Um, you wait a long time, you may get the final grant to do the phase 3 trial, but it's not going to be done in any way that can
Mhm.
sustain a company. And at the same time, a lot of what IVI does is to work not only on the supply for vaccines, but on the demand for vaccines. So with
Mhm.
oral cholera vaccine, there are countries, for instance, Ethiopia, where they didn't report cholera. They reported acute watery diarrhea. Why? Because reporting cholera scared away tourists, scared away businessmen. But part of what we have to do is say, you have a huge burden of disease here. And by vaccinating, by using this vaccine, you will greatly reduce morbidity and mortality due to cholera. And eventually the data convinced the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Finance to put together and put in a request for cholera vaccine, and that creates the demand. So we work on all sides of the equation to improve global health, both through projects, so foundations that give grants, and not only the Bill and Melinda Gates, but the Thrasher Foundation and others, but also with individual donors. We received our first big personal donation from a Korean professor who founded a successful biotech company, and another personal donation from the head of LG. But we actually haven't developed a great development program. So any advice you can get on that regard would be really helpful for us as we think through our strategy for the next 5 years.
Well, I think you'd do very good marketing and be very good at marketing in the U.S. Maybe we can get you involved in future Korea Society programs, particularly with our relation with we have a congressional study group. There's a congressional study group on Korea that we partner with. There's only 3 of these study groups in the world that Congress covers: Germany, Japan, and Korea. And it's fairly new. It's 2 years old. It's bipartisan. The Democratic co-chair happens to be a medical doctor. He was at University of California, Davis. I think he was in charge of the admissions, Tom Byrne. So maybe we could hook you up with the congressional study group. Maybe the Biden administration has a very expansive definition of what infrastructure is beyond bridges, roads, and fiber optic cables. Maybe we could try to work on getting global public health involved in definition in the U.S.
Or as the U.S. is using its excess doses around the world, effectiveness trials in countries, Madagascar, Mozambique, and Sub-Saharan Africa, or in Asia and South Asia, are going to be really critical in order to help governments understand how to control this pandemic with an emphasis on the collection of the kind of data that they need in order to do the most effective programs.
Right. Sounds like a very good area to work on in the future. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jerome Kim, for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and I've certainly learned a lot on this whole issue. So thanks again, and I hope we'll be seeing you in the future at future Korea Society programs.
Thanks, Mr. Byrne.